And we're recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of Game Design Online, an introduction to rules writing. So this is kind of the pivot point in the course. Thus far, we talked about getting a game out of your head onto the table. Overcoming those barriers that make game design difficult. We've talked about kind of the building blocks of game design, the process that we use. We've talked about where inspiration comes from and how you can generate it or chase it. We've talked about getting your test build made using idea boards, and we've started talking about, last week talked about play testing in quite a lot of detail, the process of iterating and refining your game over time. Not once yet have we talked about writing down rules, and that's kind of what this seminar and the next seminar are about. As we talked about previously, the game design process that we have, as you see here, we have quite a strict process. I like to put this up at the start of everyone just to make sure everyone's on the same page. We don't really start talking about rules writing properly until the mechanical build stage in great depth. So in the kickoff, you're just kind of figuring out what the game's going to be. In research, you're broadening your knowledge around the subject. In the test build, you might write a few things down, but just for your own reference, really. We'll talk about that later. Mechanical build is where you start involving other people properly in the process of designing your game. And so really that is where you will start writing a proper rules document. And it won't be a finished one till the full build, but we'll get to that. And handover and amends, of course, at the end. That's where you'll do a lot of rewriting because an editor has told you that what you've written is awful, in my experience at least. No, editors are lovely. So yeah, quick reminder, this is part 4. Next week is refining your rules writing. So we'll talk about adding, like taking your mechanical draft, like the rules document for your mechanical build, and turning it into that kind of that final manuscript, that full draft, adding lots of structure and diagrams and all that sort of stuff. And then finally, we'll talk about what comes next, which is an interesting one, where we talk about, all the things you can do once you've got a finished game. And that's probably the part that's going to have changed most since the last Game Design Online, because there's a lot of developments over the past couple of years. Certainly have a lot of different options of things to do when it comes to getting a game out to other people. I'll put this in. Little terminology check. So we're going to talk about rule books a lot. I'm going to talk about rule books a lot over the course of this and the next seminar. I just wanted to be clear. What I mean by that is a document which instructs players on how to play your game. Board games are vast and diverse. Board games, card games, role-playing games, all sorts of things. Any tabletop game probably has some sort of rule book, some sort of documentation. I'm using the term rule book as a catch-all, and I'm going to assume for the purposes of this that you're designing a game that has one rule book. We've seen board games that have multiple rule books, board games that have cards instead of rule books. We've seen all sorts of different things. This is about one rule book. Although the advice will apply, whatever it is you're doing. This is just to give you context for what I mean when I'm talking. Most important thing, don't forget that designing a game and writing a rulebook are 2 different things. You design your game first, then you create the documentation for it. Trying to write your rulebook first is like trying to write the manual for how to fix a car before the car has been built. And I really want to emphasize that. I say it a lot, but a lot of people, when they come to design a game, they start by writing a rulebook. Especially, this is very true of role-playing games and war games, in my experience, because the rulebook feels such an important thing. You often get these big, weighty, hardback tomes for those sorts of games, and people think that is game design, and it's not. Because, as I say, the rulebook is just there to teach the other players how to play your game. It's not the game itself. So make sure you bear that in mind. As ever, the important bit is that there's no one true way to do this. If you want to write rulebook first, that's great. Go for it. All I can tell you is how I do it, how we do it in EDCAT Games, the process that we've developed that works for us, that lets us work on a silly number of games at a time, and hopefully put out stuff that's pretty decent. As ever, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. If you want to come along to Discord afterwards, you can do. We're going to have a little chat about stuff, see what you've been up to in the week. If you want to ask any detailed questions, you can do. And again, if I'll do a little mini Q&A at the end of each section. If you have any questions during the session, put them in the chat, and then I'll answer them all in one go. So let's get going. It's 8:10. Cool. I'm going to aim for a 9 o'clock finish. Might be a couple of minutes late because I was a few minutes late starting. So first of all, what should a rulebook be doing? what is a rulebook for? What is the purpose? So a rulebook it's the conduit between you and your players. Unless you are planning to be present at every single session of your game being played, which it's an option. I'm not going to knock you for it. Unless you're planning on doing that, you need to have a good rulebook. Now, there are an increasing number of different options. I mean, one thing you see a lot of these days is videos and apps that teach games, although those are usually backed up by a rulebook. Whenever I've seen a game, excuse me, that runs just off an app, I've seen people complaining there isn't actually a rulebook to go with it because rulebooks are much easier to navigate generally. But whatever the case, in most situations, a rulebook is the only conduit between you and your players. So that means it has to do a lot of different jobs. If you imagine whenever you run a test of your game, all the things that you have to do as the designer of your game, all the things you have to do to teach the game, to answer questions during that, all of that is stuff your rulebook's having to do, and you have to consider all of that when writing a rulebook because it's a passive piece of text. It can't react to your players, so it has to preempt their questions and their concerns and things that will come up in the game. Just to summarize, really, a rulebook fills in for you at the table. It must teach players how to play. You must answer their questions, and also you can use it to sell the theme or experience when you're showing off a game. So this is from a course we ran a few years ago in person. There's chap called Anders who's showing off a game that he's designed, and he is selling the experience of that game. He's explaining to the players what they can expect from the game. He's kind of telling them what the theme is. The rulebook does that part as well. It gets helped along by your art, your box, all that sort of stuff, but the rulebook has to be the one to do the heavy lifting. So first of those is that a rulebook is a teacher. It has to explain the rules of your game to a new player. It has to teach them how to do everything from the moment they open the box to the moment they put it back on the shelf. No one else is going to tell them that. To do this successfully, you need to write a rulebook that is clear, approachable. It's a little bit gentle. It kind of welcomes players into the game with maybe some friendly language. It introduces concepts one at a time. Nice short sentences. It's probably repeating things a few times so that players don't forget them. If there's a particularly tricky concept, that might mention it a few times during like how things go. Don't forget, you only have a hand limit of 5 cards. So if you've drawn too many, you must now discard down. And you want lots of kind of diagrams, examples, things that will help players get their heads around all the concepts. People learn in different ways. If you have people who learn visually, they're probably just going to watch a how to play video, and you should definitely make one of those for your game. But having lots of diagrams and examples is a really good thing to have in your book. I always like to make games that, unless they are explicitly an app-driven game, they can be played without access to FAQs, the internet, YouTube, whatever. It needs to be a self-contained parcel. So all of that is true. All of those things are very true. But at the same time, it has to be a reference. And this is like the polar opposite in a lot of ways, because players will want to look up rules mid-game, either as like a reminder of how something works, or there's been a weird situation that they can't quite see how to work it out. So the rulebook hopefully will tell them what to do. And these are the things that when you're running playtests, you're doing like guided playtests, for example, your players will ask you these questions and you will answer them obviously in the best way you can, but your rulebook has to be doing that at the table. To make that easier, it has to be written in a structured, comprehensive manner, nice and tight, all the information for one topic in a single place, lots of chunky information. You should avoid ambiguity and cover as many possible situations as you can. You really want to be comprehensive in your rulebook. You want to avoid repetition and be as concise as possible. The more you repeat stuff, the less easy it will be for players to find exactly the thing they're looking for, because they'll go down the wrong trails. They'll think, oh, is this section about damage? Oh no, it's just talking about damage for some other reason. And you should have lots of diagrams that kind of cover off the weird little edge cases and examples that deal with that sort of thing. So what you're sort of seeing here is that's kind of running contrary to the teacher side of things, right? What about as a storyteller? This is kind of bonus credit, right? This stuff is maybe secondary to the first two, but I still think it's important. Less so for like abstract games, more so for heavily thematic games. But your rulebook can be working with the rest of your components to set the tone, evoke the theme, give the players some expectations about what the game's going to be. So if you want to do that, really, you want to be writing in like an evocative, thematic way, using colourful language, drawing the players in, and using color to give context to the rules. A player will care a lot more about what's happening in the turn if they understand what it means. Getting 2 resource points doesn't mean much. Harvesting the food they've so carefully planted probably means more. And of course, you can have illustrations and graphics and things that draw players in and, you know, make your game come to life. So those 3 things are quite different, right? Just looking at the language there. Clear and approachable language, explaining new concepts gradually. Structured and comprehensive with information carefully categorized, evocative and thematic, drawing players in. There's a lot going on, right? One sentence probably can't be all of those things, or one paragraph even can't be all of those things. So really, it's a balancing act. The act of writing a rulebook is a balancing act. Some people refer to rulebook writing as a form of technical writing, and I agree to an extent, in that it must be very precise and so on. But to me, that is the technical writing aspect is really heavily weighted towards the idea of a rulebook as a reference. I wouldn't use technical writing systems for the part of the rulebook that's teaching how to play the game, because for a player who's maybe a bit more casual, who's maybe a newcomer to gaming, they could be scared off by too much terminology and stuff. But basically, yeah, it needs to do at least those 2 things. Being a storyteller, as I say, that's extra credit. And you have to balance the elements in a way that really suits your game. It's tricky, it's difficult, but don't worry, there are ways to get them. That's kind of what the next 2 seminars are about, this one and the next one. Thing to remember is that you might not be the best person to judge how your rulebook is written. As with anything, we are terrible at evaluating our own work and spotting our own biases and blind spots. So you will continue through the rules writing process to use the testing cycle we talked about last week, the closed testing, guided testing, unguided testing, and kind of, you know, creating, testing, observing, iterating. You'll go through all of that with your written rulebook as well as the game you designed, and that will help you determine where your game is struggling, whether it's, you know, how you can evaluate how well it's doing as a teacher, a reference, and a storyteller. Okay, but the most important thing is to be aware of those 3 jobs your rulebook is trying to do, and be conscious. Ask yourself, which of these am I doing well at? Which of these am I doing less good at? The best thing to do, though, is to get good at this by researching. So being a game designer will break your enjoyment of games. I'm sorry for that. It won't really. You'll always love games. If you love them enough to be designing them, you'll always love them. But I can't open a rule book now without analyzing it in this way. And I think it makes me a better rules writer. It means I've lost the ability I used to have to skim read a rule book and know how to play the game in 5 minutes. We saw some friends recently who I'd not seen for a few years, and we opened up a new game we'd not played before, and they passed me the rule book, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't do that anymore. They used to be able to just give it to me, and I'd absorb it and tell everyone how to play. And we looked up a video online instead. Thankfully, there are more videos online than there were back when that was a thing I was doing more regularly. So yeah, look at pick a rule book for any game you've got, any game in your collection, a game you like, one you're familiar with maybe, but also you'll get a lot of data out of one that you're less familiar with. Look at it and ask yourself, how is this balancing those 3 elements? How is this doing as a teacher? How is it doing as a reference during the game? How's it doing as a storyteller? How is it evoking the theme? What works, what doesn't? How would you do it differently? And you will see lots of different approaches. And there's been some very interesting developments. I'll talk about a few of them later in this seminar. But there's been some very interesting ways people have started kind of dividing their rule books up to follow these 3 things. So so that is kind of talking about what a rule book needs to do and the things you need to think about when you're writing a rule book. Any questions on that so far? Looks like no. So I'm going to carry on. So we know what we're trying to do. Let's talk about the stages of rules writing. This should be familiar by now. This is like, you notice there's a process. Like the Needy Cat design process is quite fractal. Everything kind of replicates itself outwards. So in the same way that we have the different stages of game design, we have the different stages of rules writing. Or rather, what we're looking at really is the different stages or the different types of rules writing you need at each stage of game design. So this kind of mirrors the section we looked at last week. for playtesting. If you compare your slides, you may see some interesting similarities. So yeah, each stage of the design process, as you can imagine, has different requirements for rules writing. Again, I'm going to say it again. I've littered this statement through this seminar and next one. Don't focus on the rulebook till you've designed your game. I say it a lot because it's going to be a natural inclination. And remember those ignorables. We talked about the ignorables in seminar 1, and you've still got the PDFs. I know, like for me, I like to have them up on the wall when I'm designing things. And as I was saying before we started recording today, I actually I was doing a test build, and I almost slid into doing things I shouldn't be doing, but I thought, no, remember the ignorables. So it's all about focusing on what matters now, so you're efficient and a good game designer. So let's look at the test build first. So in the test build, as you know, we're keeping things very loose. We're not committing too much time to any one particular part of the design. And so really the writing here is scribbled notes and prompts. Oh no, my little graphics haven't worked. I'll fix this for the PDF. I do apologize. In fact, yeah, the PDF might already be okay. Those are supposed to be 3 little red crosses down the bottom left there, which slightly ruins the effect, doesn't it? But yeah, this is what you see here. This is it's a page of notes from when I was showing off demonstrating what the Hellboy vertical slice for Hellboy the board game. And this is a set of notes I'd written for myself so that I could remember some of the details of how the vertical slice was going to function. Vertical slice, for anyone that doesn't remember, is like we in our terms, it's like a small, maybe like 1 round of play, 5 to 10 minutes worth of content, just to kind of show what the core gameplay loop is. And so for this, I was going into a meeting with Mantic Games, and I was showing them how the game worked. And as you can see, it's all very loose. This is just for your reference at this point. It doesn't need to be a thing that you're going to show to anyone else. It doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. It can be scribbly and shorthand and awful, and you don't need to explain the game. At this stage, you are writing to record your thoughts, nothing else. Well, here we go. I'm going to add some things. Here we go. No, it's neither a teacher, nor a reference, nor a storyteller. It is just there for you, for your benefit, okay? Next up, the mechanical build. Let me just quickly amend this. Here we go. I'm going to have a little cross there, a little tick there, and a little cross there. There we go. So the mechanical build, things start tightening up. At this point, you're looking to codify all of the rules. That's what you're trying to do. Codify as in set them in stone. So you're writing down all of the rules. I've put a little asterisk there, all the rules that you have at this stage, because at the mechanical build, at the start of it, you're not going to have everything laid out. But you are aiming for breadth, not depth. What I mean is every rule is represented here. You might not go into great detail on each one. You won't cover off every single edge case. And you might miss out some of like the advanced or optional rules maybe. But you're trying to get a full playable set of rules written down and set in stone. Once they're written down, it's more difficult for you to change them, which feeds back into what we talked about in the playtesting seminar about how you'll make changes less frequently as you get to this stage of development. You're going to use like a basic structure. You're not going to worry too much about structure, but you're going to use a very simple structure to organize your thoughts. That's really what it's there for. It's a tool to organize your thoughts, and the actual logical order of it won't make it won't matter too much now. We'll refine that in the next stage. Let's look at the next stage. But first, as we see, it's not yet a teacher. It's not a storyteller. You don't have to worry about adding narrative in that. It is just a reference. You are going to remember at this point, you're going to be teaching the game to people, and you're going to be letting them then go and play. Whether they're then testing guided or they're taking it away and doing unguided testing by themselves, you are teaching them the game, so the rulebook is not having to kind of take that burden from you. And then finally, we come to the full build, and this is where you're writing your final manuscript. So this is going to include everything you want to have in the final version of your rulebook. So all your examples, all your diagrams, all your text. You're going to carefully consider the structure. We'll talk about that next week. The flow of rules, how information is presented. Make sure things are introduced in the correct order, and you're not referencing rules that haven't been explained yet. I was reading a rulebook the other day that did this very badly, and it made me quite angry. But that's, comes with the job, right? At this point, you are writing a rulebook that's going to communicate to your players. This is your rulebook that's going to replace you. at the table. So at this point, it has to be a teacher, it has to be a reference, and if you want, it has to be a storyteller as well. Again, that's a thing that, you don't have to do the storytelling, but I think it helps. So just to compare those three, this is like the section from those three. This is the development of the Hellboy, the board game rulebook, through those three stages. This is just grabbed from three. I grabbed two random stages, plus I found a notebook, basically. So this is talking about how enemies work. And if you look at the, obviously the test build one at the top is very loose and very, very straightforward. Enemy AI, if they shoot, they roll shoot versus agent's defense. If they fight, they roll fight versus agent's defense. If they're stunned, they get up. Easy. Down here in the mechanical build, we can see that we're kind of talking in full sentences. If there are enemies on the board, they're all activated. The agent chooses the order they go in. When an enemy activates, it follows these steps. We're not covering every single eventuality. So it says the agents choose the order they go in. We're not saying, what if there's a disagreement? We're not worrying about that. We're just getting the basics down. And we're kind of going through here, and there's bullet points. It's still quite loose, even though it's in full sentences. The full draft, it gets longer, and we're talking in a way which is going to be explaining things to the player, because this is aimed at new players. And in hindsight, I think the Hellboy rulebook has got far too many words in it. I think if I had a chance to do it again, I would cut an awful lot out. But still, it's much more a teacher than a reference. And even as a teacher, I think it's a little bit overly verbose. But what you can see here, in this phase, each enemy on the board is activated once and will usually do some combination of moving and attacking. So it's introducing the concept and then going into detail of how that works. Minions are activated in groups according to their type. Each minion will have an enemy card, etc., etc., etc. You can also see we've got a little snippet of a card there showing what the enemy tags are, for example. So that stuff we wouldn't have in the mechanical build, but we've got it in here. So you're seeing a progression through from one to the next. To be clear, I would say that what you're doing at the test build stage, that's not a rule book, that's notes. Mechanical build, you're writing a simple rule book, which is basically a reference. I would even call it a rules reference. Full build is where you're really writing a rule book. Okay. Mechanical build is a simplified rule book. And if you want a nice little snapshot of the ignorables here, this is kind of a rough guide. So this tells you whether a thing should be included at each stage. In the test build, you're getting your core game rules in there, but you're not worrying about making them look pretty and nothing else. That's all it is. You're not worrying about how to set up the game. You're not worrying about objectives, structure, examples of things, diagrams, color text, or flavor text, narrative text, no tutorials. Mechanical draft, you're bringing in your breadthening, right? You're not deepening, you're breadthening. So you're going core game rules, setup, objective, structure, all the stuff about how the game kind of works is there. And you may be using examples and diagrams when something's really unclear and you want your players to be able to make sense of it. But you're not putting in color text, you're not worrying about tutorials. It's only in the full draft you start doing all of that stuff all at once. So so that kind of talks about the stages of rules writing and what we think of at each one of those. Any questions? There's one in the chat. You're a really visual person, so you like to write the rules on computer. Yep. I write them as if I were telling them to someone else, just more organized. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Sliveboard examples, border cases, etc. No, I think that's a great way to look at it. I think one thing I'll talk about in a minute actually is when you're first writing a rule book, it really helps to kind of run through the game in your head, or and explain how you would play it. I mean, teaching a board game is a whole skill set in itself. There's an awful lot to be said for proficiently, consciously and proficiently looking at how to teach a board game to someone in person. But that's the thing that you'll get good at over time as you develop your game, as you test your game more, and you get more used to running those guided tests and teaching your game to people. You'll find out, oh, actually, if I mention the objectives here and talk about the detail of this thing over here and whatever else, you'll get better at it. Conventions are a great thing for this. If you go to a convention and you run demos or a playtest table for your game, you will run that game more times than you want to, and you will get very good at teaching it quickly, and that will help you know what needs to go into your rulebook. So yeah, that's good. To be fair, I also these days I tend to test build on the computer rather than in notepad form. Sometimes I do. If I want to get away, get a break from the screen, I'll go and sit somewhere nice and write rules in longhand. But I like computers, and I like being able to undo and copy and paste and all that sort of stuff. Sophie is the opposite. She will work longhand as much as she can, and only use computers when absolutely necessary. Okay, cool. We're doing good for time here. So let's have a look. What have we got next? Talking about mechanical build rules writing. So this is looking at how you take. So you've got your test build. You've gone through the test build. I know a few of you are working on test builds right now, which is great. I love seeing that stuff in Discord. It makes me really happy. If you're watching this after, if you're not watching it live, if you've bought this later, please still post your test builds, your works in progress, your exercises in the Discord server, because I love seeing it. I know some of you have been doing that. And once you've iterated and worked on your game for a while, you will get that core vertical slice, that kind of 10 minutes of good gameplay. And you won't have worried too much about setting up or objectives. You're just getting that core experience really refined. Once you've done that, then you're going to come to the mechanical build. And that is a great time to start doing some rules writing as soon as you're happy with your vertical slice. As I said, it might have been last session, I think, where I talked about when you move on from one to the next. It's often a blurry line. It's sometimes hard to say exactly where one finishes and one ends. But what I like to say is when your vertical slice is at the point that you're not making big changes to it anymore, when you feel that is representative of the game, that is the time to move on to the mechanical draft. And that is where we're going to start looking at, writing some rules down. So yeah, as it says here, once you're happy with your vertical slice, you can codify the rules for it. And that's going to give you a really good basis for your first draft of your reference rule book, your reference book. Now, as I said earlier, you're not going to worry too much about structure at this point, but there probably are some common elements that would be good to include. So we'll talk about what some of those kind of things will be. But most importantly, we're going to talk about how you actually get started doing that. First of all, some tips, because again, these are things which it's really easy. It's very easy once you shift gear. When you go from doing lots of testing at the table, I'm going to sit here and test and refine and iterate and observe and all of that, and suddenly you switch gear and you're now sitting in front of a computer typing away. It can be very easy to fall back into bad habits. So this is a good time to check in on your bad habits and make sure you're not falling into them. So first one is don't get started on the rules writing until you have a vertical slice you're happy with. It can be very tempting to have one really good vertical slice playtest and go, oh, this is actually looking really good. I'm happy. I'm going to move on right now. Don't do that yet. Take time. Go back. You might be happy with it. But if you haven't taken the time to try a few different things out, push in some different directions, if you haven't gone back to your idea boards and looked at your rejected ideas and seen if actually with context they might be better than you initially thought, if you haven't done that, there's a chance you're going to do that later. What you're doing with your vertical slice is you're building the foundation of your game design. Okay. And after that, anything you do in the mechanical build, when you start writing rules, is building onto that foundation. So if at any point you go back and change part of that foundation, everything crumbles and you have to start with that work again. Now, it might be the case that you get lucky and you make a big change to something which doesn't have too many knock-on effects, but it really is not worth the risk. I've had games where this has happened, either because we've realized something quite late on, because we didn't do enough work in the earlier stages, or because the client has changed a brief halfway through a project. And it's very disheartening to have to go back and undo a whole load of work. And if we were in a position where we were obliged contractually to finish the game, but if it happens to you on a hobby design project, that can be a passion killer. That can be a thing that makes you not want to go back and carry on designing it, and that can help resign your game to the reject bin. So make sure you've put enough work into your vertical slice before you start writing rules. Remember the ignorables. Yeah. So again, go back. I keep saying it, but go back. They're kind of the fundamental principle of the Needy Cat Games design course, not the design process, rather. Sorry, is the fact that you can ignore certain things each stage. Don't jump ahead, right? Also, as part of that, don't try to make your first draft perfect. When you first write a rule book, it's like any kind of writing advice. You always see this in writing advice, like novelists and screenwriters and that sort of thing. Don't spend too much time refining each bit before you move on. Just try to get it all out. Because if you spend time honing, refining, and polishing each individual little piece, you'll never get the thing finished. And again, that will stop you from actually finishing your game. And really, the point of this is to finish games, right? Finished is better than unfinished. Even if your finished thing is not as good as your unfinished thing might one day have been, the point is it's done. Aim for breadth, not depth. So just to be clear, again, what I mean by that is you're aiming to cover as much of your game as possible in your rules. You're not worrying about every single edge case. They will come up in testing, and you will get them through refinement. Do not worry. Use simple, clear structure. Just organize things into headings based on what they are to do with. We'll talk a lot more about structure in next week's session. There's a whole chunky section on how to use structure and headings to guide players through your rulebook. But you don't have to do that level of it here. All you need to do is think about here are the rules for setting up. Here are the rules for character creation. Here are the rules for whatever it might be. Just think easy sections. Again, the more rule books you read, especially ones that are similar for similar games to the game you're making, the more you will get comfortable with the kind of order that things can go in. An important one is you don't need to write your book in the order that it will be read. This is quite big, I think, for a lot of people. Certainly when I realized it felt like quite a revelation, because I felt, okay, I'm going to write a rule book. Overview. This is a game about XYZ. Components. These are the components. Setup. This is how you set up to play a game. And the problem is that's the boring part, right? That's the stuff that is, well, it's boring, and also it's difficult if you try doing that part first, because you haven't necessarily tightened up all the things you're introducing. So you don't need to write in that order. We recommend starting in the middle and then filling out in both directions. So that's some general tips before we get started. So let's say you've got your vertical slice, you're happy with it, you want to push on and start writing some rules down. So what do we do? First of all, write down the rules for your vertical slice. As Renato said in the chat, you can imagine you're telling them to someone else, however it is you might do it. You can even I had to do this briefly when I had when I attempted it. Sorry, I was looking at going into surgery to have carpal tunnel surgery, so I wouldn't be able to type for a while. So I was looking into voice dictation, and not great for kind of complicated last stage writing. For this sort of thing, it kind of works. Or even just recording yourself and then transcribing that. Go through the motions of teaching your game and note that down. Try to be comprehensive. Try to go into as much detail as you can on the various different things that can happen. Don't worry about trying to, boring a player or anything. Just get it out there. Then, without worrying about it too much, play through it. So do that closed test where you're just playing through it by yourself or with a trusted design partner. Play through it, and you will spot things that you've missed. You definitely will. There's no two ways about it. You will not have got everything down. And then go into that test cycle, right? So you've made the rule book. You're going to test it. You're going to make observations based on that test, and you're going to refine that and iterate it. Keep on going. Again, don't worry about covering every eventuality, because they will be ironed out over testing. You'll get to that point where we had the graph last session. We showed like the iterations, the amount of change over time with each iteration, and you'll find in your early ones you'll have missed loads of things out. By the end, you'll be just very, very finely polishing the elements of your game. So once you've done that, once you've kind of got the first ideas down on paper, and what you'll have covered there really is the core engine of your game. Okay, pause. This is a chance to stop writing and reward yourself with a bit more design. Okay. Or maybe it's a time to put down the reward and go back to the slog of designing, whichever one it is that you find more enjoyable. They're two different skill sets and two completely different things. If it were up to me, I would hire a rules writer to write my rules for me, because it's not the part of the job that I enjoy. Because at this point, what you've done is you've made your test build. You've focused really hard on the core gameplay. You've now codified that in writing. So now is your chance to go and actually design the rest of the game around it, or at least the rest of the mechanical build. So what this means is you're basically going to think that is the central part of the game. This is like a 10-minute slice of the middle of a game session. What happens before and what happens after? Picture your player taking the game off the shelf, opening the box, or whatever it is they do to set up your game. What are the steps they must go through to reach the point of that vertical slice? And then also ask yourself, during the vertical slice, what are they aiming towards? What's the end game? How does the game end? What are the victory conditions? And so on. So think of all of that. And you might also want to add some more detail to the core mechanics. So you might say, for example, that in your test build, let's say you're doing a war game, you might have just written rules for one unit, maybe for your test build. And now you're going to add half a dozen more. So you're going to do all of this. And this is not, it says pause. It's not a short pause. This is a thing that can take time. Don't rush through it. This is just as important a part of development as the vertical slice thing. You're basically doing all of that again and developing the rest of your game. Okay. You're going to, again, follow that create, test, observe, repeat cycle. And you're going to start filling out your game. At this point also, create a list of components, because you're going to start having to kind of make those components soon, right? In the process of playtesting your mechanical build as it grows, you will create nicer components, because in your test build, you probably kept them quite scrappy and quite loose. But now you're going to want to kind of start thinking about, bringing in nicer looking components. They haven't got to be covered in lovely artwork, but maybe they're a bit cleaner, a bit easier for players to recognize and understand. And it's good to make a list of all the components you need for your game at this point for two reasons. First of all, we're going to use it in a moment, but also it's good to have a list so that when it comes to making prototypes, you have a nice little checklist for the things you need to make, whether that is virtual or physical. So once you've done that design work, however long that takes, and it could be days, weeks, months, whatever, then you can fill out your draft. So each time you kind of you solidify a section. So actually, yeah, we've got the setup rules we're really happy with now. Then you write those up. You add them into your draft of your rule book. And you want to kind of fill out the whole thing. A good order for things to go in roughly at this stage, again, don't worry too much, is maybe a component list up front to say, what things you need. Because if you have that on the front of your rule book, when you unpack your prototype, you can just do a quick check when you turn up to a playtest session. Have I got this, and this? Yes, excellent. After the first dozen tests, you won't need to. It'll be seared into your brain indelibly forever. But at first, it really helps to have that up front. Then how to set up. For your benefit, when you're doing the guided tests, you might not need that. But certainly when you give this to your testers who have learnt the game to go and play more games, they might need to refer back to it. Core mechanics, so how the game actually functions, what happens during the game, how the game ends, determining a winner. That's kind of your minimum standard, really. Of course, your game might not have a winner. You might not have a set game end in sight. If it's a role-playing game, you might have multiple sessions and the players agree when the game ends. But you're kind of getting all that information in here so people can play your game from start to finish. You might, and this is especially a sign that you've jumped the gun a little bit, but you might realize that you've, in the process of writing, that you didn't design something. You left something out. So that probably is a sign you haven't playtested it as much as you should. But if so, again, hit the brakes, stop writing, because anything you add to your written document risks changing as soon as you develop the game. So stop, put the brakes on, go back and continue development and fill out that stuff that you forgot. Then add it to your document. Don't just write it down and go, I'll deal with it later. Worst case scenario, you forget to deal with it later and something unfinished and wrong goes into your rulebook. I've definitely done that in the past. Or you have to go and develop it and you make changes and those invalidate other things that are in your rulebook. And again, see, it's written. I think I set a rule to write this about every 3 slides. Remember the ignorables. Don't worry about where are we? Let's find that document. Don't worry about color text. It's lovely to have it in there, but you don't need it at this point. It's just confuse things. Don't worry about writing a document that teaches the game. Again, it's technical writing. It's describing how the game works. It's not explaining how the game works, if that distinction makes sense. So it's describing in very cold clinical terms, not the kind of the warm, welcoming, guiding hand teaching someone how to play. Once you've done that, it's time to review your draft. I recommend, once you finish writing it, close it, save it, close it, give it a couple of days, or at least a couple of hours. But I like to go and work on something else for a little bit, and then come back to it. Especially the way that I work, I tend to work in fits and starts. I will sit and I will do hours upon hours of work on a thing, walk away from it, come back, and then realize that I wasn't doing anywhere near as well as I could have done there. I could have tightened things up a lot. And if I'd stayed working at that pace, I wouldn't have noticed those things. So it's good to kind of get away, refresh yourself, work on something else, take a walk, whatever it might be, then come back and read through it. I personally like to print it out and use highlighters, make annotations to things by hand, because you're going to find things that you're not as happy with. You might find duplications or omissions. So duplications where you've mentioned a rule twice, omissions where you've completely forgotten to include a rule. Try to see it as a new player would. A good way to do this is to actually try playing through the game using that as your guideline, and see if all the things that need to happen are listed. You need to ask yourself, are things appearing in a logical order? Again, structure is a thing we'll talk about in more detail in the full build, but you need to think, well, if I'm coming to this for the first time, are there any terms that are being used before they've been explained properly? One of the terms I talk about is mental load in terms of rules. So when you introduce a brand new term to a player, a deployment phase, or whatever the term might be, imagine a little flag is raised in your player's brain with that word on it, that thing, because they know that you are ascribing it meaning, some kind of rules meaning. It has weight in the game beyond its standard meaning in regular conversation. Until you explain what that term is, that flag is still raised and waving because they're not sure about what it is. And they're having to devote some part of their brain to remembering that's a thing, and they need to know what it is. As soon as you explain it, that flag drops down again. Try not to raise too many flags at once. Okay, and again, we'll talk about that in more detail in next week's seminar. It does help at this stage get someone else to read your book. If you've been testing lots, you'll probably have people who have been doing this, and you can fire a copy out to all your testers and say, hey, does this make sense? Is this a document that is representative of the game you've played? I hope I haven't written something which is about a whole different game. Get as much feedback as you can. And then start testing it, because playtesting is game design. So create some different prototypes. You can create just one. I like to create multiple. I tend to make 2 or 3 at a time as a minimum, because it's often easier to bulk make stuff. If you're doing one set of things, you might as well do 3 sets. But also it means you have spares, and it means you can run multiple sessions at once. And you can start guided testing. So you'll have been doing the closed testing by yourself while you're writing it and just reviewing it yourself. Now you get people to the table and you get the game out and you run through the session using that rulebook as a framework. You're filling in the gaps to them. You're doing all the teaching work, all the storytelling work that your rulebook is not set up to do at this stage. If something comes up, a question or something that you notice is an omission, make a note of it. But before you do, see if the rules give an answer. At first, you can do this yourself and check it up. But also, later on, you can start getting the playtesters to do it for you and say to them, so if you're at the point where you're running guided tests for 5 different sessions at once in a room, this is a thing we do quite a lot, then you can kind of, if someone has a question, you can say, have you checked the rulebook, please? See if it's in there and tell me how long it takes you to find it, because that's an important piece of information, right? And they'll go through and they'll find it, or they won't. And if they don't, you can give them the answer. And if they, even though they do find it, if it took them a long time to find it, make a note of that as well, because you want to then start thinking in your later drafts, can you make it easy to find that rule? As ever, observe, analyze, iterate, follow that process, and then you're going to hone that text. So whereas you weren't worrying at the start about adding too much detail, you're going to start, adding even more, a bit more depth to each of your things, and maybe adding some breadth as well. But remember, you are only creating a reference. Those ignorables are still really important. You're not going to transition this into a full build rulebook. We're going to completely rewrite from scratch when we come to the full build rulebook, the full manuscript of your game, because that's a very different document than the one we're creating here. So remember the ignorables. Don't start adding in color text and lots of tutorial stuff. Leave that for now. Make this the best version of what it is, which is a reference to your game. Finally, little note on version control. Never delete old work. Keep everything. Become a hoarder. Probably, by the time your game is finished and out on the shelves, maybe at that point start, considering going back and cleaning up your folders. But really, you should be keeping old versions. If you're using digital online software, like so we keep everything on Dropbox or Google Drive. We kind of mix and match them depending on the project. If you're using Google Drive, that's quite handy. You can roll back to previous versions of files. But I still like having archived copies that I can easily switch back and forth to and from, because there'll definitely come times when you want to go back to an earlier draft of a thing. You'll find that you've got rid of a rule, and you think, actually, you know what? Now that we've changed everything else around it, maybe that rule wasn't wrong. Maybe that rule was right. It was everything was not great. So you can go back and bring that one in. Having access to your old versions is really handy for that purpose. If you're feeling really, really clever, you could maybe keep a note of what changes between versions. Change logs and update logs are a great thing to do. I'd never get around to them generally. And I just get stressed about trying to maintain them. But if you do, it's a very useful tool. But yeah, whatever the case, it's a good thing to do. So what I tend to do is whenever I sit down to make amends to a thing, I will start a new document. So I'll save a new copy with the next version number or whatever it is I'm doing, and then put the old one into an archive folder so I don't accidentally open that. There's nothing worse than accidentally opening an old. So say I'm on version 1.7, I accidentally open version 1.5 and start making changes to that, because then I have to untangle the new changes from the old changes. Oh, it becomes a whole nightmare. So try to find a system that works for you. Whether it's, you're doing version numbers. So we tend to go version 0. Something for the test build. So 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. We don't go decimal. So we do go 0.10, 0.11, which maths, it hurts from a maths point of view, but it's still, it's still important. Then we get to mechanical draft and then we start with like 1 something. We'll move to 2 something when we make a significant change. We do a big restructure, or we've rewritten at least half of the book in one go. And then, then whatever the next thing is what we use for the full draft. Although I often I make the rules draft, the full build manuscript becomes manuscript version 1.0 as opposed to mechanical build rulebook version, whatever. So yeah, archiving is really important. So yeah, that's the end of that section. Great point for Simon there. Thank you, Simon. Set old versions as read only. I hadn't even thought of that's a great way to consider it. Yeah, I'd not thought to set them as read only. That's brilliant. Wow. Better phrase. Which risks can you incur in merging different? Oh, sorry. There's a question back up here. So let me have a look. Can you have a game composed by different vertical slices at different stages of development? The rulebook would be at different stages. Yes, I think so. What you're asking there is, can you have a game where you've got the core mechanics, you've got a vertical slice of core mechanics that you're already happy with? So that's like a final vertical slice, and then you're doing a vertical slice of like setup or whatever, or maybe you've got a big sprawling game with different elements, like a Twilight Imperium kind of thing. So you've got battle rules and political rules, whatever else. You can totally have multiple vertical slices at once. I would recommend trying to keep it simple at first. When you first start designing things, have a go at going through the process with something which only has like one of those. But if you're doing something more complex, then absolutely yes, you kind of can go through the whole process multiple times within the single design process. So you build your vertical slice for one thing and develop that to the point you're happy with it. Then you bring in a second thing and you do a vertical slice for that, and you write up the rules for that, and you kind of gradually bring things together. You have to be careful that you don't previous one in some way or link into it. So if I were, for example, doing Twilight Imperium is a decent example. If I was doing like the space combat rules, and I then wanted to test out the political machination rules, it's been a while since I played TI. I would still want to do them within the context of the combat, of the space combat rules. How do those things link? Rather than develop them completely separately, because you then run the risk of having a game that's made of 3 or 4 completely separate games, and that might be what you're going for. But yeah, I would say try to keep each one in mind. So yeah, what risks can you incur in merging different vertical slices? That's the thing. Yeah, is you will get ones which you'll end up with the feeling of having too many like different games in one, and your game might not hold together thematically. You might not have coherent gameplay player experience. So if one part of your game is really exciting and frenetic and lots of energy and player interaction, and another part is much more sedate and slow, that becomes quite difficult to kind of bring those together later. And what you probably end up doing is minimizing one and maximizing the other, because that's the overall thing you want your game to be. And so yeah, it's if you can, it is better to develop the core rules and then the game as a whole, rather than individual little steps. But again, every game is different. Whatever works for you is the correct thing. All I can say is, our method. Cool. Any last questions? No, I don't think so. If anyone's got anything else, if not, let's talk about the exercise. So if you want to do this again, and if you can do it now, you can do it later. There's no time limit. This is just the whole point of this course is you can work through it at your own pace if you want to, and it will help you design a game. And whenever it is you come to that, you can do this exercise or not. It's entirely up to you. So we're going to basically look at doing some mechanical draft rules writing. We're not looking to do a lot here. What you should do is pick a game you know well. You could use your test build if you've already been developing that. If you've not been doing it for long, it might be too early to do this, but you can always do this exercise later. You want to identify a vertical slice. So identify whatever it is. If you're using an existing game, find what the vertical slice would be. So for example, if I were testing Catan, Catan's a good example, right? The vertical slice I'd want to do is 1 round of gameplay with the resource roll, trading cards, building things. You want to just model that in some way, get that out there. Wouldn't worry about setting up the board, wouldn't worry about trying to score, wouldn't worry about your longest road and all that sort of stuff. Write those rules up following the steps that we've gone through in the slides. Keep it simple, just focus on the core mechanics. Again, go for breadth, not depth. And then post the results up on the Discord channel. Don't feel the need to kind of go massively in depth on this. Don't try to write a complete rule book. The whole point of this is to get some practice at writing a simple rules document and set your expectations when you come to write your own mechanical build for your game, because what you don't want to do is sit down to do it and immediately jump into loads of detail. Keep it simple, yeah? And that is it. We are 1 minute to 9 o'clock. We've somehow managed to squeeze it into the hour. Fantastic. So thank you all, as ever. Hopefully that's been useful. Next week, we're going to talk about rules writing in more detail, talk about structure and headings and formatting and identifying rules terms and all that sort of stuff. The fun part, really, honest. But yeah, if this has been useful, you've already got your slides. You'll have, I'll get some other bits and bobs out to you in an email tomorrow. I'll try not to forget this week because I forgot last week until the next day, or until a couple of days later, in fact. But whatever the case, if you've enjoyed this, do tell people. It helps us keep running these. Yeah, I'm going to go and head over to Discord and have 10, 15 minutes of chat. If you want to come and join us, if you want to come and just listen, you can do. If you want to come and just type things, you can do that. Whatever it is you want to do. Whatever the case, though, it's all over. Thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you over there.